Perry Mason, episode 2. I have thoughts, but before I get into that, with spoilers, just so you know, so if you don't want spoilers, come back after you've seen the episode. But before I get into my thoughts, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing, and if you give me a like, I'd really appreciate it. So let's get into Perry Mason, and I'm just going to talk about the things that stood out to me because this was a really, really brisk episode filled with a lot of development. And I really appreciated that because in my last review, I mentioned one concern I had. It was that this show was going to lose steam as it went on. I had this concern that there wasn't going to be enough plot on a week-to-week basis. But thankfully, every scene this episode was important. It was either establishing information or establishing characters. There weren't any scenes where I felt like, well, that was a waste of time. Which is good, because there's only 8 episodes. You really should be able to fill out that many episodes with meaningful plot, especially when you have this many characters. And speaking of characters, there were a lot of new characters this week. Obviously, I think that the character that'll probably be the standout new character to most people is Sister Alice, played by Tatiana Maslany. I can't help but get Penny Dreadful, City of Angel vibe. I watched that show really recently, and she reminds me of Sister Molly in a number of ways. But obviously this is a different show and a different character, and it's going to be interesting to see what's going on with her. She's still kind of an enigma in this show so far. Now, she was introduced in a very intriguing fashion. The focal point of the shot where they introduced Sister Alice was the microphone on the stage that she was standing on, and the way that the camera was positioned, you couldn't see her face right away, so you were forced to focus not on her face but on her voice. And I think that this was an intentional choice. I think they're trying to emphasize the way that she has her power is through her ability to speak to people through her voice. And she is a radio preacher, and a lot of people, that's how they're coming to be familiar with her. And I also just thought that the scene was well done in that her speech was highly, highly specific to its audience, and that she's talking about food and hunger to people in the midst of the Great Depression. And this would be a very, very powerful message at that time when people were so often not able to have their daily needs met. I also thought that I'm a little confused by her motivations, as I said, but the speech at the end of the episode that she gave at the funeral for the Dodson's baby, when she talked about blessed are those who will basically kill whoever did this, blessed are those who will fight the devil, who will fight the evil people responsible, who will execute the evil people responsible. I kind of felt like this speech, instead of the Beatitudes, was like the devil attitudes, but it was a very, very well-delivered speech. She's definitely bringing a lot of verve and energy to this character. I just would like to know a little bit more about her, before I'd say that she's knocking it out of the park. This episode also had a lot of World War I flashbacks designed, I think, to fill in Perry Mason's backstory. And I thought that these were well shot. HBO has a long history of doing really, really cinematic television. And I mean, they basically tell you it's not television, it's HBO. That's their tagline. And this wasn't like Battle of the Bastards level, but it was still quite impressive that they were able to pull this off on a HBO show. Oops, just noticed my AC was really loud in the background. Sorry about that. So I was impressed with this sequence. I did, however, feel that there were a couple things about it that I had to question. Like, I don't know why they split it up into 3 sections. It wasn't really obvious what was triggering him thinking about it, particularly in the last sequence where he's standing on the street corner watching the person sing his song. I wasn't really clear on why is he thinking about this now? Why is this triggering this memory? It just seemed like they wanted to spread that throughout the episode more than there was a natural stream of consciousness to it. And I also felt that rather than kind of giving us insight into Mason's specific state of mind and his specific torments, I felt that a lot of this just felt like an excuse to show a spectacular World War I battle, and it was not so much about psychology as spectacle. So that was something that I questioned. I did think that Matthew Rhys was excellent, as usual, during these sequences. I particularly thought his acting was good when he was executing the wounded men in order to put them out of their misery, and we were finding out how he became known as the Butcher of Montfalcone. And I particularly appreciated the way he would pause. Like, they weren't like actors, they weren't like the pauses of an actor hitting his marks. They were like very, very like real person pauses. Like, I felt like a way a person might naturally pause in this situation as he hesitates to end the life of another human being, even one that's going through immense suffering. And just the torment on his face was just very, very well done. I thought that this was a much better acting showcase than the scene in the first episode where he was reacting to the corpse of the baby. I still felt like this sequence didn't feel like it fit naturally into the story, but I felt like it, at least within the sequence, was more effective. Another new character we got to see this episode was Officer Drake, played by Chris Chalk. And I like Chris Chalk a lot, and I think he's doing a lot to make this character very, very likable and very, very engaging. I do feel like this character kind of lacks a lot of depth so far. I feel like he's kind of falling into the stereotypical sidekick role at this point. Like, I know he's not a sidekick yet, but I think that they're building up to that. And obviously, there's going to be some initial friction between him and Perry Mason, but in this instance, it just seems like that's obviously where this is going, and that kind of takes away from his agency as a character. I did like the initial scene where he was introduced. I thought that it was very, very well done. The black man with the rifle and him telling him, hey, don't ever point a gun at a police officer, which is, obviously a very, very timely theme, although they're not necessarily saying a lot with it. It's just, something that we can understand today, not so much something that has like a theme yet. I felt like a little bit of the dialogue at the police station between Drake and his fellow officers was kind of heavy-handed and clearly intended to just establish things to the audience. Like, for instance, when the officer said, there's no black police detectives, I felt like that was not something that they would actually feel the need to express. And I get that sometimes you have to have characters say things that they wouldn't actually feel the need to say, because how else are you going to give the audience information? But I think that there might have been a smoother way to write those lines. It felt a little bit heavy-handed on the nose, as I said. This episode, I felt like I got a better understanding of John Lithgow's E.B. Burchard, and I like the dynamic that's playing out between him and the new character that was introduced this episode of D.A. Maynard, played by Stephen Root, who is a very, very talented actor. It's kind of funny how I think a lot of people's association with him is with his role in Office Space, but he's actually done a lot of dramatic work in recent years. And here he is clearly this person who has some similarities to Burchard, but he's clearly a lot more devious than he is, a lot more willing to bend the truth to get what he wants. And it was interesting. I feel like Burchard is kind of limited by, he kind of thinks that there's a right way to do things, as we see in his interactions with Strickland, which to me were some of the funniest interactions this episode, when he tells him that he doesn't comp for whorehouses, and Strickland, played by Shea Whigham, is telling him, no, I had to do it to blend in. I had to do it to keep my cover. I thought those were some hilarious exchanges as how they kept going back at each other. But I thought that it was clearly intended to indicate that Burchard has a very, very strict view of how things should be, and whenever people kind of deviate from that, he's going to have issues with them. And I think it's interesting also to see how he's very much coming to the defense of Herman Baggerly, played by Robert Patrick, who we find out is actually Matthew Dodson's father, which, this fits with the theme that everybody has secrets, and everyone's secrets were coming out this episode. But this scene was particularly interesting because Mason clearly was frustrated with Baggerly for lying to them, and you could see Burchard kind of trying to push back, like, no, Mason, don't react this way, just kind of let it go. But there was definitely this dynamic there that I thought was interesting to see play out. And I'm sure that Patrick has more secrets, that Patrick's character, Baggerly, has more secrets that are going to come out over the course of this show. I liked the line where he said, "We tell each other what we need to tell each other, do we not?" And I felt like it was interesting because he kind of seemed to be willing to let go of Mason's animosity, because I feel like he could have made that situation a lot more uncomfortable. But essentially he seemed to be willing to say, I'm willing to let go of the fact that you're the butcher of Montfalcone if you're willing to move on from the fact that I didn't reveal the whole truth to you immediately. There was some on-the-nose dialogue this episode. I particularly thought that a final exchange between Mason and Burchard at the restaurant, where Mason essentially was saying, they didn't need to grab Emily Dodson before she got to see her child buried, which I completely agree with. I don't know why the police grabbed her in that situation. The only thing I can come up with is I think that they wanted to make it clear. It was the best way to make the public know that they were taking action to solve this brutal murder of a child. But Mason is like, they didn't need to do that, and Burchard says they told me that they weren't going to do that, but who tells the truth anymore? And the "but who tells the truth anymore" line particularly stood out to me as being on the nose. We got to see Mason being a very, very clever detective this episode. I particularly thought it was clever the way he found out who Emily Dodson was calling when he jumped into the phone booth and asked the operator for the last number that she had called. I thought that was a well done scene. And we see a little bit of friction developing between him and Della Street, played by Juliet Rylance, who here, we don't know a lot about her character yet, but she clearly is a more intuitive person and a less skeptical person than Perry Mason. And I liked their exchange where she says that she can tell that Emily Dodson had nothing to do with it because she can just, hanging out with her, she has a feeling that it wasn't that. And Perry Mason's comeback was really good. He was like, well, I've got a guy downtown who's got no feeling in his head, so don't talk to me about your womanly intuitions. I appreciated that dialogue. I thought that was a good sparring session. So I'm starting to really enjoy the character interactions and dynamics, particularly between Burchard and a lot of the other characters. And I really, really look forward to next week's episode. I hope that they can keep the pace of development going at a similar level to this episode. There was one last scene I should probably mention, which is the body that we found. And as I said, that this show kind of has this theme that everybody has secrets that they're covering up. And when Mason found Emily Dodson's lover with his head blown apart, ghastly image. I think that's one of the most violent aftermaths of a gunshot effect that I've ever seen portrayed on television. And I think this was one of the few times this episode where I really felt they were just relishing the gore. Because even in the World War I sequence, it was very, very gory, but I felt like that's a understandable sequence in which you would want to portray the horrors of war, even though I felt like they might have gone a little too far. But this sequence, I felt like it was just, they were relishing the gore. And it brings to mind something that Roger Ebert, or I believe it was Roger Ebert, said about Silence of the Lamb, comparing it to its sequel Hannibal, in which he said, in Silence of the Lamb, we had all these horrific images, but you felt that the director was kind of embarrassed or ashamed to be showing it to you, and you only saw it in fleeting glimpses, and it made you feel like it was realistic, but still not being like the director kind of just shoving it in your faces. And then in the sequel Hannibal, it was the opposite, where it became very, very schlocky. And I feel like this to me seemed like a very schlocky sequence. Now, again, there was some purpose to it because Mason eventually found a clue, which I think what he found was the fragment of the tooth, which had gotten rattled loose when George fell to his death off that roof and then got moved there by the police detective. And I think that that's going to come into play because Officer Drake found that fragment on the steps. I think that's what he found. It was a little hard to tell, but I think that that's going to be pivotal to Mason eventually solving this case. But at the same time, I felt like this was just really over-the-top gore. So it was an interesting sequence, though. So overall, I thought this was a stronger episode. I thought that it built on the first episode quite well. I was really glad to have these new character additions, and I'm looking forward to next week's episode. But let me know what you thought in the comments. Let me know if you enjoy the new characters, which new characters stand out to you. Let me know what you're most interested in seeing explored as Mason and Chalk and Della Street and these other characters investigate the case. So those are my thoughts. Let me know what you thought in the comments. Subscribe if you're enjoying this video and want to see more videos on this channel. And as always, you can watch more videos right now.